Well, I just have one thing to say before we start, which is I have done it! My brothers and sisters, I have finished the book. The book. Universally Preferable Behavior, a Rational Proof of Secular Ethics. It is a magnificent work, if I do say so myself. Oh, it is the holy grail of philosophy, and it's been sought since the time of Socrates. I believe I have done it, but it's important, of course, for you to review that.
Hello my fellow apes, I hope that you and your loved ones are well. Recently I've had a few interactions with Stefan Molyneux in reference to David Hume's is-ought distinction, otherwise known as Hume's guillotine. In a nutshell, a few weeks ago Stefan attempted to defend his universally preferable behaviour, UPB, against James Theodore Stilwell III. I know, what a name. And during their debate, yours sincerely came up a few times.
I don't know what the dude's name is, Mr. Shaggy, right? Rationality rules.
Yikes. Alright, Dr. Molyneux, keep your knickers on. I'll be honest, that edit took me way too long to make, but since it's going to give you nightmares, I consider it time well spent. Anyhow, throughout their exchange, James highlighted many of the logical fallacies and issues with the 5 proofs that Stefan insists upon in his book, and just as when others have pointed out these flaws, including myself, the walking, talking Dunning-Kruger effect, that is Dr. Evil Molyneux, failed to adequately respond to them, either because he doesn't understand them, or, indeed, because understanding them is catastrophic to his argument.
How can you be so obtuse? What did you call me? Obtuse? Is it deliberate?
Perhaps the most obvious example of Stefan's obtuseness, and I would argue the most damning, is his take on Hume's guillotine. His take is so obtuse, in fact, that it in and of itself exposes the folly of not only UPB, but Stefan as a moral philosopher entirely. Now, I appreciate that I'm coming off a bit harsh here, but honestly, there's a reason why the academic world doesn't take this man seriously. Put it this way, a moral philosopher misunderstanding Hume's guillotine is like a mechanic misunderstanding a spanner. And in Stefan's case, it's actually worse than this, since he claims to have won the holy grail of philosophy. Now you might be wondering, why spend more time on this dead argument? I've already illustrated that depending on what definition of UPB Stefan employs, because he uses 2, he's either simply repackaging Kantian hypothetical imperatives, or he's critically misunderstanding Hume's guillotine. And so why touch on this again? Well, it's for 2 primary reasons. The first is that addressing dead arguments is kind of what I do. And the second is that I have the hypothetical imperative, the goal, of wanting to show others, you, a clearer way to expose UPB. After seeing just how dense Stefan is in the minutes to follow, I'm convinced that pretty much anyone that can be dispelled from his sophistry will be. So, outside of an actual one-to-one debate, this will likely be the last video I make on this subject, though I'm not making any promises. So let's get to it. This is Molyneux's Humean suicide. I assume that most of you are aware of Hume's guillotine, but for the sake of clarity, in his work titled A Treatise of Human Nature, Hume observed that there is a significant difference between descriptive statements, that is, statements of what is and is not the case, which is to say facts, and prescriptive statements, that is, statements of what ought or ought not be the case. From this observation, Hume expressed that since the conclusive oughts of most moral arguments do not follow from their factual is premises, most moral arguments are therefore nothing more than non sequiturs. Now, Stefan claims not only to understand Hume's guillotine, but states on page 9 that he fully accepts it.
I fully accept the Humean distinction between is and ought.
And yet, over 10 years later, it's more obvious than ever that he doesn't understand it, at least publicly. To illustrate this, I'm first going to respond to a segment of his debate with James, and from there contextualise Stefan's misunderstanding with his first and primary proof of UPB.
So when rationality rules says that my argument is incorrect, right? He's not saying everybody is always rational and always prefers rationality all the time, right? He's saying that my claims are not just subjectively wrong. They're not just, well, I don't like the font that he used, or the cover design of the book could have been better, or something like that. He's saying that I am objectively incorrect.
We agree there, yes.
Okay. And that truth,
part, yes.
And being correct is preferable to error.
He's not saying preferable.
Yes, he is.
No, I'm not. As I posted in the comments, I am not saying that being correct is preferable to not being correct. I am not, in fact, saying anything at all about preferences. All I'm saying is that it is the case that Stefan is objectively, factually incorrect. Or as James later put it,
Again, rationality rules is not making a prescriptive claim, he was making a descriptive claim.
indeed, I am only making the first claim that Stefan expressed.
He's saying that I am objectively incorrect.
But why, then, does Stefan insist that I'm also making the second claim?
And being correct is preferable to error.
Well, it's because Stefan is convinced that in order to correct him, you must enact a universally preferable behaviour. To most effectively spell this out, let's listen to how he conveys his primary argument for UPB in his book. It goes as follows.
1. The proposition is the concept, universally preferable behavior, must be valid. 2. Arguing against the validity of universally preferable behavior demonstrates universally preferable behavior. 3. Therefore, no argument against the validity of universally preferable behavior can be valid.
As said, this is the primary proof that Stefan offers for UPB, and here's what it looks like in the debate.
The moment that you say that I'm wrong, the moment rationality rule says that I'm wrong, then you are exhibiting UPB.
Indeed, Stefan boasts that the moment you try to prove him wrong, you prove him right, since to prove him wrong you must enact universally preferable behaviour. So how does he get to this conclusion? What universally preferable behaviour is being enacted? Well, to cut to the chase, Stefan notes that in order to have a debate, one must accept a wide variety of implicit premises, such as that we exist, that we have the capacity for accuracy, and that we can communicate. But among these correct implicit premises, he has a few false, such as correction requires universal preferences. He writes,
If you correct me on an error that I have made, you are implicitly accepting the fact that it would be better for me to correct my error.
Now there are two things to highlight here. The first is that just like the word fitter and greater, the word better only has meaning in reference to a goal, a hypothetical imperative. To illustrate this, consider this statement. It would be better for Stefan to sprint as fast as he can. Am I correct? Without a reference, this statement is vacuous. If Stefan's goal is, say, to win a 100-metre race, then it would be better for him to sprint as fast as he can. But if his goal is to rest his broken leg, then it would not be better for him to sprint as fast as he can. Likewise, if Stefan's goal is to be publicly accurate about UPB, then it would be better for him to correct his error. But if his goal is to keep the person in his basement hidden from the person in front of him, then it would not be better for him to correct his error.
You're sheltering enemies of the state, are you not?
The word better is thus contingent. It necessitates a hypothetical imperative to make any sense. And the second thing to highlight is that when someone corrects Stefan, they are not necessarily implicitly accepting the fact that it would be better for him to correct his error. While it's fair to say that most people accept this premise, that is, they assume that Stefan has the goal of being accurate about UPB, others don't make this assumption. I, for example, don't. When I correct Stefan, I do so because 1. I have the goal of being accurate about UPB, and I know that by publicly expressing a critique, I increase the chances of someone else correcting me should I be mistaken. And 2, I assume that you, the viewer, have the goal of being accurate about UPB. I do not, however, assume that Stefan has the goal of being accurate about UPB, because honestly, I'm not entirely convinced that he does. It's for this reason that I don't tell him that it would be better for him to change his opinion. I don't, in fact, tell anyone that it would be better for them to change your opinion. Indeed, I don't make any ought claim whatsoever. I exclusively make an is claim. It is the case that Stefan is incorrect. Stefan continues.
Your preference for me to correct my error is not subjective, but objective and universal.
Except it's not. My preference for you to correct your error is, as given away by the word preference, subjective. Now don't get me wrong, whether UPB comports with reality is in the realm of objectivity, but one's preference for knowing if UPB comports with reality is subjective. Or to put it another way, the descriptive claim, it is the case that UPB is fallacious, is objective and universal, but the prescriptive claim, you ought to correct your error, is not universal. It's contingent on a hypothetical imperative.
You don't say to me, you should change your opinion to mine because I would prefer it, but rather, you should correct your opinion because it is objectively incorrect.
Again, no. Stefan is missing the most important premise, the Kantian hypothetical imperative that he wants to be correct about UPB. Without this additional implicit premise, the statement "you should correct your opinion because it's objectively incorrect" is as vacuous as the statement "you should sprint because it's objectively faster than walking." Without such an implicit premise of Stefan actually wanting to win the race, that is, without the implicit premise of Stefan wanting to be correct about UPB, we can't say that he should or ought, or that it would be better for him to correct his opinion. Okay, so with this now all on the table, let's pivot back to my comment in which I expressed this nuance to Stefan. Here's how he responded.
Ha ha, oh look, you corrected me again according to universal principles. Don't worry, I'm sure you'll get it eventually.
Honestly, it's like debating a presuppositional apologist. Just as the apologist insists that correcting him presupposes God, Stefan insists that correcting him presupposes UPB. Anyhow, a few days later, a dude tweeted at me that the name Rationality Rules is deriving an ought from an is, to which Stefan replied, "Of course." Which might just seem like trolling, since he's very clearly said,
I fully accept the Humean distinction between is and ought.
But it's unfortunately not trolling, since Stefan has in other places claimed that you can get an ought from an is.
If you can't get an ought from an is, you are getting an ought from an is, which is you ought not talk about getting an ought from an is. Like you have already created one.
Stefan, saying that you can't get an ought from an is an is statement, not an ought statement. Hume didn't imply that you ought not get an ought from an is. He implied that it is the case that you can't get an ought from an is. Honestly, I'm starting to think that the only way I can get this through to you is by putting it in terms of ovaries. So there you have it, folks, Molyneux's Humean suicide. He's the self-professed moral philosopher that misunderstands Hume's guillotine. He's the equivalent of the mechanic who misunderstands the spanner, the driver who misunderstands the driving wheel, the baker who misunderstands the flour, and the midwife who misunderstands the ovaries. Yes! Done it! Now he get it! Now I could conclude here, but I'm going to respond to a few more ways in which Stefan employs this argument, just to make the flaw more obvious. But before doing so, I just want to sign off by saying that I'm Stephen Woodford, thank you kindly for the view, and an extra special thank you to my wonderful patrons and those of you who have supported the channel via other means. Thank you for supporting me during this difficult time.
Like if I say 1 and 1 make 3, and someone says, no, you're wrong, 1 and 1 make 2, then they are saying I ought to be accurate, I ought to be truthful, and I ought to say things that are valid rather than invalid.
No, you're wrong, Stefan. And just like your mathematical example, this is a descriptive claim, not a prescriptive claim. It is the case that you're wrong. Now, if I really wanted to make the additional claim that you ought to be accurate, then I must first assume that you have the goal of being correct. If you want to be correct, you ought to be accurate. Without this hypothetical imperative, without this if clause, I could not and would not make such an assertion.
So when someone tells me that something is false and that I should not advocate for or believe something that is false, then they have said that I ought to do something, right?
Okay, so there are two claims in play here. The first is descriptive.
So when someone tells me that something is false
and the second is prescriptive.
And that I should not advocate for.
The first is an is statement.
Something is false.
And the second is an ought statement.
I should not.
If someone makes the second claim, they are implicitly accepting that you have the hypothetical imperative of being publicly correct. If you want to be publicly correct, you ought not advocate for UPB.
So he's saying he's objectively right, I'm objectively wrong, and being right is preferable to being wrong.
Again, there are two claims here. I am making the first descriptive claim.
He's saying he's objectively right, I'm objectively wrong,
but I am not making the second prescriptive claim.
And being right is preferable to being wrong.
And again, the second claim can be conceived as a hypothetical imperative, as in, since you have the goal of being accurate, being right is preferable to being wrong. But as a standalone sentence, this is nothing more than a fart in the wind. It's akin to straight up asserting that sprinting is preferable to not sprinting. It's vacuous.
I'm sorry, I really, maybe this is just getting too complicated for my little brain here, but...
Finally, Stefan, you've made a descriptive claim without fusing it to a prescriptive claim. It is the case that Hume's guillotine is too complicated for your little brain. Now, to be clear, I don't think this is the case. I think that you can understand Hume's guillotine, and that if your goal is to be publicly accurate about UPB, you ought to correct your error. However, if your goal is to keep selling your book and maintain your handful of lackeys who boast that you are the greatest moral philosopher of all time,
It is the holy grail of philosophy. It has been sought since the time of Socrates.
then you ought not to correct your error.